The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, number 32. Hello and welcome to another session of the world's 100 greatest books from IntelliQuest. In the next few minutes, you'll learn about the legendary American writer Nathaniel Hawthorne and listen to a description of his most famous work, The Scarlet Letter. Nathaniel Hawthorne was born in Salem, Massachusetts on July 4, 1804. He was the first writer to judge Puritan society while exercising profound moral and psychological insight into the reasons humans do things. Hawthorne devoted himself to developing an American point of view because he felt that too much being written at the time simply imitated British writing styles. His works dealt with both the real and the imaginary. Hawthorne frequently complained that his life contributed very little to his fictional material because it was so uneventful. He and his two sisters grew up with his widowed mother. An uncle provided the funds for him to go to Bowdoin College in Maine, where he graduated at the age of 21 in 1825. He worked in obscurity from 1825 to 1837, publishing numerous tales and sketches anonymously in magazines and newspapers. Unable to support himself with his writing talents, Hawthorne worked for the Boston Custom House, and in 1841 joined an experimental utopian community at Brook Farm. He married Sophia Peabody in 1842 and moved to Concord, Massachusetts, where he met Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, among others, and resumed his serious writing career. In 1846, financial need forced him to resume his customs career as surveyor of customs in Salem, Massachusetts. Then, when a change of administration resulted in his dismissal at age 44 in 1849, he began his most productive writing years. From 1849 to 1852, he wrote 3 novels, including The Scarlet Letter and The House of the Seven Gables, and a collection of short stories. In 1852, Hawthorne wrote a campaign biography of Franklin Pierce, an old college friend, and when Pierce was elected president in 1852, Hawthorne was appointed United States Consul at Liverpool, England, and served from 1853 to 1857. Hawthorne spent 3 more years in Europe, 2 of them in Italy, before returning to Concord in 1860. His last novel was The Marble Faun, the first American novel to explain the cultural differences between America and Europe. It was completed in 1860. After returning home, he completed no more novels and died at the young age of 60 in 1864. The Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne's most famous work, takes place in Puritan 17th century Massachusetts and features the conflict between the desire to confess one's sins and the need to conceal the truth. His interest in guilt, sorrow, and alienation were just the opposite of the optimistic assumptions that ran wild during his time, when men had confidence in the future, faith in commerce, and belief in self-reliance. The Scarlet Letter is a somber tale of sin and redemption featuring a young woman named Hester Prynne. 2 years before the story began, her husband had sent her from Amsterdam ahead to Massachusetts while he settled some business affairs in Europe. Alone in Boston, Hester had taken a lover and given birth to a daughter which shocked the Puritans of Boston. She further angered them when she refused to divulge the name of the child's father. Although such a sin was punishable by death, the Puritan magistrates decided to have mercy. They sentenced her to stand for several hours on a high scaffold in the town square, where everyone would be able to view her. She would hold her baby in her arms and display a red A on her breast to signify she was an adulteress. Part of her punishment was that she had to wear this red A for the rest of her life. The story begins in June 1642. A group of Puritan men and women have gathered in front of the prison, waiting for Hester to make her appearance. Hawthorne describes the setting as one of unsightly vegetation except for one rose blooming on the side of the prison door. He wonders if this rose is the symbol of another rebellious woman, Anne Hutchinson, who a few years ago had entered the same prison door. At this moment, the author picks one of the roses and presents it to his readers, so that it may, in Hawthorne's words, serve to symbolize some sweet moral blossom that may be found along the track, or relieve the darkening close of a tale of human frailty and sorrow. Hester, wearing a beautiful gown, walks from the prison to the marketplace, carrying her tiny daughter in her arms. It is at the scaffold in the marketplace where Hester will receive her punishment. On the breast of her gown, writes Hawthorne, in fine red cloth surrounded with an elaborate embroidery and fantastic flourishes of gold thread, appeared the letter A. As she walks, she is insulted by Puritan women in the crowd. "It were well," muttered the most iron-visaged of the old dames, "if we stripped Madam Hester's rich gown off her dainty shoulders, and as for the red letter which she has stitched so curiously, I'll bestow a rag of mine own rheumatic flannel to make a fitter one." Some of the women demanded that Hester be put to death. To many people at this time, religion and law meant virtually the same thing. Hester walks with natural grace and a force of character, Hawthorne writes. The young woman was tall, with a figure of perfect elegance on a large scale. She had dark and abundant hair, so glossy that it threw off the sunshine with a gleam, and a face which, besides being beautiful from regularity of feature and richness of complexion, had the impressiveness belonging to a marked brow and deep black eyes. She appears stately and dignified. While she is careful not to show desperate recklessness in her mood, it is shown in her spirited dress, which she has made while in prison. The Scarlet A particularly gets notice from the townspeople. To escape the pain of it all, Hester daydreams of her poverty-stricken youth in Europe. She recalls her marriage to an older, misshapen scholar for economic reasons, not love. While on the scaffold, Hester is prodded to reveal the name of her child's father. Reverend Wilson, Governor Bellingham, and Reverend Dimsdale all speak to Hester. Hester refuses to tell. Meanwhile, in the back of the crowd, Hester sees an Indian watching her. Beside him is a white man with one shoulder lower than the other. She recognizes him as her husband. Suddenly, he recognizes her. Then, when he notices that she is staring at him, he raises his finger and puts it to his lips as a signal of secrecy. Talking to others in the crowd, the man asks who the father of the child is, and is told that Hester won't say. Meanwhile, the young Reverend Dimsdale speaks directly to Hester. He tells her that if she feels that for her soul's peace she should divulge the name of her lover, then she should speak out the name. He tells her that since her sin has been revealed, she should not hold back the name of the child's father, because he may not have the courage to confess. Still, Hester will not speak the name. "Speak, woman," said another voice, coldly and sternly proceeding from the crowd about the scaffold. "Speak, and give your child a father." "I will not speak," answered Hester, turning pale as death, but responding to this voice which she too surely recognized. It was the voice of her husband, Dr. Prynne. "And my child must seek a heavenly father. She shall never know an earthly one." When her time on the scaffold is complete, she is returned to the darkness of the prison. Since Hester and her baby both need medical attention, a physician named Roger Chillingworth is brought to them in prison. It is actually her husband, Dr. Prynne. After giving them medical aid, Chillingworth, as he will be called from now on, tries again to find out the name of his wife's lover. She refuses. Then they talk. He admits that he did her wrong by marrying her when she did not love him, and she admits she did wrong by having an affair and bearing an illegitimate child. "I have greatly wronged thee," murmured Hester. "We have wronged each other," answered he. "Mine was the first wrong when I betrayed thy budding youth into a false and unnatural relation with my decay. I seek no vengeance, plot no evils against thee. Between thee and me, the scale hangs fairly balanced. "But, Hester, the man lives who wronged us both. Who is he?" "Ask me not," replied Hester Prynne, looking firmly into his face. "That thou shalt never know." He tells her that few things can remain hidden from a man who devotes his life to finding them out. He says he wants to find out who the man is, not to have the man punished, or to do harm to him, or to damage his reputation, but to, as he puts it, ruin his soul. Then Chillingworth asks Hester not to reveal his identity. Hester swears that as far as the rest of the world will know, her husband is dead. And above all, she agrees not to tell the identity of her husband to her lover. Chillingworths' revenge had begun. Hester's term of confinement ends. Hawthorne writes, "Her prison door was thrown open, and she came forth into the sunshine, which, falling on all alike, seemed, to her sick and morbid heart, as if meant for no other purpose than to reveal the scarlet letter on her breast." She leaves the prison and moves with her daughter Pearl to a little cottage near the ocean. She earns her living with her outstanding ability to sew and embroider. And she spends her extra time doing charity work for those less fortunate than herself. While she could go anywhere, to Europe or into the western wilderness, Hester chooses to stay near the scene of her trial. Hawthorne explains, "There is a fatality, a feeling so irresistible and inevitable that it has the force of doom, which almost invariably compels human beings to linger around and haunt ghost-like the spot where some great and marked event has given color to their lifetime, and still more irresistibly, the darker the tinge that saddens it." Hester becomes a very popular seamstress and makes a good living at it. She has become the seamstress of choice for many of the area's most elite families and earns a good living. But when she ventures out, she is often met on the street by preachers who draw huge crowds as they give her moral advice. "Clergymen paused in the street," describes Hawthorne, "to address words of exhortation that brought a crowd, with it mingled grin and frown around the poor sinful woman. If she entered a church, trusting to share the Sabbath smile of the universal Father, it was often her mishap to find herself the text of the discourse. She believes that no fellow mortal is, quote, guilty like herself, end quote, but has learned to recognize sin in others from her own experience. She shuddered to believe, yet could not help believing, that it gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in other hearts. While Hester wears somber garments, she dresses Pearl extravagantly in vivid colors. Pearl grows into a beautiful and graceful child. She is bright and spunky. She finds it difficult to obey rules, and she has no friends her age because Puritan society will not let its children associate with the daughter of an adulteress. "This could never be," writes Hawthorne. "Pearl was a born outcast of the infantile world. An imp of evil, emblem and product of sin, she had no right among christened infants." As a result, Pearl makes up her playmates. She sees tall pine trees as Puritan elders, and the ugliest weeds in the garden as their children. She stomps them or uproots them. Soon the neighboring townspeople consider little Pearl an offspring of the devil. The talk of the neighboring townspeople who, seeking vainly elsewhere for the child's paternity, and observing some of her odd attributes, had given out that poor little Pearl was a demon offspring on earth, through the agency of her mother's sin, and to promote some foul and wicked purpose. Considering her a bad influence on Pearl, there is talk in the town of taking Pearl away from Hester. To head this idea off, Hester goes to see Governor Billingham, one of the most vocal promoters of this design, to ask him for help. Along the way, some Puritan children decide to taunt Hester and Pearl. "Behold, verily, there is the woman of the scarlet letter, and of a truth, moreover, there is the likeness of the scarlet letter running along by her side. Come, therefore, and let us fling mud at them." Hawthorne explains, "But Pearl, who was a dauntless child, after frowning, stamping her foot, and shaking her little hand with a variety of threatening gestures, suddenly made a rush at the knot of her enemies and put them all in flight. She resembled, in her fierce pursuit of them, an infant pestilence, the scarlet fever, or some such half-fledged angel of judgment, whose mission was to punish the sins of the rising generation. Governor Bellingham, accompanied by the Reverend John Wilson and Arthur Dimmesdale, is surprised to see Pearl. He questions her about her Christian upbringing, and although Pearl has been taught all the religious doctrine that Bellingham requires, she does not provide adequate answers, and he is intent on taking Pearl away from Hester. "God gave me this child," cried she. "He gave her in requital of all things else, which ye had taken from me. She is my happiness. She is my torture none the less. Pearl keeps me here in life. Pearl punishes me too. See ye not she is the scarlet letter, only capable of being loved, and so endowed with a millionfold the power of retribution for my sin? Ye shall not take her. I will die first." Hester then appeals to Reverend Dimmesdale to help her keep her child. The Reverend convinces Bellingham that Pearl should remain with Hester by saying that Hester is a fallen woman and needs Pearl as a living symbol to help protect her from further sin. After making his successful plea, Dimmesdale withdraws to a nearby window. Pearl goes to him and puts her cheek against his hand. The minister, after a brief pause, then kisses the child's brow. Roger Chillingworth, who was really Hester's husband, Dr. Prynne, decides to practice medicine in Boston to find out who Hester's lover is. He already suspects Reverend Dimmesdale, and becoming his constant companion, he finally moves into the same house with Dimmesdale. Dimmesdale, meanwhile, is starting to show signs of a bad heart. When Dimmesdale feels pain in his chest, he clutches his breast with his hand to cover the pain. The frequency of the pain made the action of his hand almost reflexive. While some people are glad that Dimmesdale is close to Chillingworth's medical help, others feel a change in Chillingworth from a calm person to one who has become ugly and evil. An extreme view is that Chillingworth is haunting the young minister as a representative of the devil. "This diabolical agent," describes Hawthorne, "had the divine permission, for a season, to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man, it was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see the minister come forth out of the conflict, transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the perchance mortal agony through which he must struggle towards triumph." Chillingworth tries every trick he can think of to make Dimmesdale confess to being Pearl's father. But Dimmesdale, who doesn't seem to catch on to what Chillingworth is about, refuses. Then one day, Chillingworth finds Dimmesdale asleep. He pulls back the garment covering the sleeping man's chest and discovers what appears to be a self-inflicted wound in the shape of a letter A. In evil glee, Chillingworth leaps in the air and waves his arms madly. Hawthorne writes, "Had a man seen old Roger Chillingworth at that moment of his ecstasy, he would have had no need to ask how Satan comports himself when a precious human soul is lost in heaven and won into his kingdom." His suspicions confirmed, Chillingworth mentally tortures Dimmesdale even though the young minister doesn't realize what he is doing. He wants to confess his sin, but cannot bring himself to do so because his congregation considers him to be the holiest of the holies. Certain that Dimmesdale is guilty, Chillingworth decides to become the friend who Dimmesdale can confide in. He begins to manipulate Dimmesdale like a cat plays with a mouse. Meanwhile, Dimmesdale becomes ever more compassionate in his preaching, earns much praise, and becomes famous among the Boston area clergy. He is able to interpret everyday things as having spiritual significance, and his congregation believes him to be a miracle of holiness. All this adulation makes Dimmesdale want to stand in his pulpit and confess his sins even more. There are times when he tells his congregation that he is vile and unworthy, but never does he explain why. However, at night he spends hours of agony thinking about his sin. He fasts until his body trembles with weakness, keeps midnight vigils which deprive him of much-needed sleep. In these lengthened vigils, writes Hawthorne, his brain often reeled and visions seemed to flit before him. Now it was a herd of diabolical shapes that grinned and mocked at the pale minister, and beckoned him away with them. Now a group of shining angels, who flew upward heavenly as sorrow-laden, but grew more ethereal as they rose. One night, Dimmesdale's remorse draws him to the scaffold that Hester had been forced to stand on 7 years before. And thus, describes Hawthorne, while standing on the scaffold in this vain show of expiation, Mr. Dimmesdale was overcome with a great horror of mind, as if the universe were gazing at a scarlet token on his naked breast, right over his heart. On that spot, in very truth, there was, and there had long been, the gnawing and poisonous tooth of bodily pain. Without any effort of his will or power to restrain himself, he shrieked aloud, an outcry that went pealing through the night, and was beaten back from one house to another, and reverberated from the hills in the background, as if a company of devils, detecting so much misery and terror in it, had made a plaything of the sound, and were bandying it to and fro. Thinking that the whole town would hear his shrieks of anguish and awaken, only Governor Bellingham and Mistress Hibbins, the governor's sister and a witch, were startled. After they retire, Hester and Pearl join him and hold his hand. Chillingworth watches the three of them as a meteor streaks across the sky, illuminating the area. Dimmesdale thinks the meteor has taken the shape of an A, as in adultery. However, the members of the congregation who saw the meteor report the next day that they think the A stands for angel, since Governor Winthrop had died that night. At this point in the story, Hester realizes that Dimmesdale's physical condition is caused by more than his guilt, and she suspects Chillingworth. For 7 years, Hester has led an exemplary life. She has helped the poor and never fought back when people abused her. Now people are beginning to think of her letter A as a symbol of Abel, since she is truly a sister of mercy. Hester's own plight helps her understand what Dimmesdale is going through. She decides to help him by meeting Chillingworth and talking the matter over with him. Hester finds Chillingworth gathering herbs in the woods and demands that he tell Dimmesdale his true name and why he is torturing him. She has come to the conclusion that she hates Chillingworth. When Pearl makes a green A out of seaweed on the beach, the subject of Hester's scarlet letter comes up. Hester toys with telling her daughter the truth, but does not. Pearl repeatedly asks Hester about the relationship between the scarlet letter and the minister's habit of clutching his heart with his hand. "What shall I say?" thought Hester to herself. "No, if this be the price of the child's sympathy, I cannot pay it." Then she spoke aloud. "Silly Pearl," said she, "what questions are these? There are so many things in this world that a child must not ask about. What know I of the minister's heart? And as for the scarlet letter, I wear it for the sake of its gold thread." Hester and Dimmesdale finally meet in the woods and discuss things that have been bothering them for the past 7 years. When they first meet, he is very surprised. They almost act as if each is surprised to learn the other is alive. After much small talk, the subject of their sin finally comes up. He tells her that he has no peace, nothing but despair. He says that if he had no conscience, he would be at peace. Hester points out that he does much good and is much loved by his congregation. "The people reverence thee," said Hester, "and surely thou workest good among them. Doth this bring thee no comfort?" "More misery, Hester, only the more misery," answered the clergyman with a bitter smile. Dimmesdale says that all he can think about is his great sin. "You wrong yourself in this," said Hester gently. "You have deeply and sorely repented. Your sin is left behind you in the days long past. Your present life is no less holy in very truth than it seems in people's eyes. Is there no reality in the penitence thus sealed and witnessed by good works? And wherefore should it not bring you peace?" Dimmesdale talks of needing someone to talk with, and Hester says she would gladly be that person. And finally, she tells him that Chillingworth was her husband, and what Chillingworth has been doing to him. At first Dimmesdale is outraged that she had not told him sooner, and cries, "Woman, woman, thou art accountable for this! I cannot forgive thee!" "Thou shalt forgive me," cried Hester. "Let God punish. Thou shalt forgive." Telling Hester that she is forgiven, Dimmesdale realizes that Chillingworth's crime, the sin of vengefulness, is much worse than his. Knowing that Chillingworth will now know that Dimmesdale doesn't trust him, the minister wonders what he should do. Hester suggests that he leave Boston and start a new life elsewhere, and then she suggests that she go with him. For 7 years Hester has been looking at life as a spectator, while Dimmesdale has become a prisoner of society. At first, Dimmesdale feels he shouldn't leave Boston, but the more he thinks about it, the more he realizes that life away from Boston with Hester might be better. This thought brings him a sudden, surprising feeling of joy. "Do I feel joy again?" cried he, wondering at himself. "Methought the germ of it was dead in me. Oh, Hester, thou art my better angel. I seem to have flung myself, sick, sin-stained, and sorrow-blackened, down upon the forest leaves, and to have risen up all made anew, and with new powers to glorify him that has been merciful. This is already the better life. Why did we not find it sooner?" Hester tells him not to look back. Then she undoes the clasp that is holding the red A and throws the symbol of shame on top of a pile of withered leaves. The letter almost falls into a stream. Throwing the letter down gives Hester a great sense of relief. Then she takes off her cap and lets her beautiful long hair fall down over her shoulders. He smiles tenderly, and as if by magic, her beauty reappears. Remembering that Pearl is playing nearby, Hester calls to her. Pearl walks slowly toward her mother because Dimmesdale is present, having shied away from him in the past. Pearl hesitates for a long time before joining them, then gets angry. Finally, Hester realizes why. She picks up the scarlet letter and puts it back on. Then she tucks her hair back under her cap. "Dost thou know thy mother now, child?" asked she reproachfully, but with a subdued tone. "Wilt thou come across the brook and own thy mother, now that she has shame upon her, now that she is sad?" "Yes, now I will," answered the child. "Now thou art my mother indeed, and I am thy little Pearl." Pearl comes to her and kisses her. She even kisses the scarlet letter. Before Pearl reached them, Hester had commented about how much she looked like her father. Dimmesdale said he had noticed that too, and was worried that someone might suspect. Hester and Dimmesdale planned to leave the colony on the 4th day following their conversation in the woods. The plan is for Hester and Dimmesdale to leave for England aboard a ship that is currently in Boston Harbor. Through her good works, Hester has become acquainted with the ship's captain and some of its crew. On his way home, Dimmesdale feels totally free of the restrictions of the church. Along the way back to his house, he feels impulses to do strange and wicked things. First, he meets one of his church's elder deacons. He has to restrain himself from saying bad things about the communion supper, one of the most sacred parts of Puritan church services. Then he meets one of the elder female members and has to restrain himself from whispering an argument against the immortality of the human soul in her ear. When he meets the youngest female member of the church, he considers whispering thoughts that might mislead her later on, but instead acts like he doesn't recognize her and walks past. Next, When he meets a group of little Puritan children, he thinks about stopping to teach them wicked words, but restrains himself. After running across a drunken sailor, he considers shaking the man's hand and carrying on an off-color conversation with him, but does not. And finally he runs into Mistress Hibbins, who suggests that he has been in the forest with Chillingworth. But Dimmesdale says he has been to see his friend, the Apostle Elliot. Mrs. Hibbins does not believe him. When he arrives at his home, Dimmesdale's newfound view of life makes him feel as though he doesn't belong there. His surroundings look strange to him, because he knows he is a different man. Hawthorne writes, "He seemed to stand apart and eye this former self with scornful, pitying, but half-envious curiosity. That self was gone. Another man had returned out of the forest, a wiser one, with a knowledge of hidden mysteries which the simplicity of the former never could have reached. A bitter kind of knowledge, that." When Chillingworth enters and asks about Dimmesdale's health, the minister tells him that he will no longer need his remedies. He says it in a way that communicates to the physician that Dimmesdale is no longer a trusted friend, but a bittersweet enemy. Chillingworth then asks if there is anything he might do to help Dimmesdale prepare for his sermon the next day. He adds that people are afraid that they might lose their minister. With double meaning, the minister answers, "Yea, to another world." Chillingworth does not even consider that Dimmesdale is considering leaving Boston. After Chillingworth leaves, Dimmesdale burns the sermon he had begun. Then, with great excitement, he begins another, which he wrote with such an impulsive flow of thought and emotion that he fancied himself inspired, and only wondered that heaven should see fit to transmit the grand and solemn music of its oracles through so foul an organ pipe as he. Thus the night fled away as if it were a winged steed, and he careering on it. Morning came and peeped, blushing, through the curtains, and at last sunrise threw a golden beam into the study, and laid it right across the minister's bedazzled eyes. There he was, with the pen still between his fingers, and a vast, immeasurable tract of written space behind him. The new day is one of great celebration. The citizenry of Boston had elected a new governor, and it is a public holiday which features parades and activities. Everyone wears their best clothing and gathers in the marketplace. The high point of the day is the election sermon which Arthur Dimmesdale will give. Pearl and Hester arrive in the marketplace. Hester is in her conservative garb, while Pearl is decked out in gay colors. Hester thinks of being on the high seas in a few hours, while Pearl hops around with bird-like movements. All types of games are going on, and everyone is in a great mood as they await the procession. Soon Chillingworth enters the marketplace, talking to the captain of the ship that Hester and Dimmesdale plan to sail on. The captain sees Hester and explains that one more passenger will be going with them, Chillingworth. The captain has told Chillingworth that Dimmesdale is sailing, and thinking that the two men are close friends, he assumes Chillingworth will be welcome. Hester looks up. At that moment she beheld old Roger Chillingworth himself, standing in the remotest corner of the marketplace and smiling on her. A smile which, across the wide and bustling square, and through all the talk and laughter and various thoughts, moods, and interests of the crowd, conveyed secret and fearful meaning. Hester knows that he has discovered their attempted escape, and is going along to prevent it. Before Hester can get over the shock of what she has just learned, the procession approaches. First comes a fife and drum band, next a procession of soldiers dressed in brightly colored uniforms, then the 7 magistrates who rule the colony, and finally Arthur Dimmesdale, the minister who will deliver the election sermon. Dimmesdale looks confident and proud, not beaten down like he had been. Hester does not go inside the church. Rather, she listens to his sermon near the scaffold where she once stood in shame. Meanwhile, Pearl, who has been running about, is given a message by the ship captain to take back to Hester. It says that Chillingworth will bring Dimmesdale on board, and that she need only to take care of herself and Pearl. Upon hearing this news, Hawthorne writes, that Hester's strong, calm, steadfastly enduring spirit almost sank at last on beholding this dark and grim countenance of an inevitable doom, which, at the moment when a passage seemed to open for the minister and herself out of their labyrinth of misery, showed itself with an unrelenting smile right in the midst of their path. After the sermon, which had to do with the relationship between God and man, the audience pours into the marketplace. Many of them are marveling at how wonderful the sermon had been. At the end of the sermon, Dimmesdale had prophesied a glorious future for the people of the Boston colony. This is certainly Arthur Dimmesdale's high point as a minister. He has delivered the speech as if it would be his last. Arthur joins the procession as it leaves the church. In the middle of the marketplace he receives a huge cheer. But when the people look at him, he seems to have changed. The glow, writes Hawthorne, which they had just before beheld burning on his cheek, was extinguished like a flame that sinks down hopelessly among the late decaying embers. It seemed hardly the face of a man alive, with such a death-like hue. It was hardly a man with life in him, that tottered on his path so nervelessly, yet tottered and did not fall. As he approaches the scaffold, Dimmesdale pauses. Then he turns toward the scaffold and beckons Hester and Pearl to join him. Realizing what Dimmesdale might be planning, Chillingworth tries to stop him, but Dimmesdale says, "Thou art too late. With God's help I shall escape thee now." The three climb the platform, and the crowd cheers, not because they know what is happening, but because Dimmesdale's speech has inspired them. 4 people are now on the scaffold: Dimmesdale, Hester, Pearl, and Chillingworth, who says he must be with the people he knows best. Dimmesdale says he is dying and wishes to share Hester's shame. Then he addresses the crowd. "People of New England, ye that have loved me, ye that have deemed me holy, behold me here, the one sinner of the world. At last I stand upon the spot where 7 years since I should have stood, here, with this woman whose arm sustains me at this dreadful moment from groveling down upon my face. Lo, the scarlet letter which Hester wears. Ye have all shuddered at it, but there stood one in the midst of you, at whose brand of sin and infamy ye have not shuddered. Now, at the death hour, he stands up before you. He bids you look again at Hester's scarlet letter. He tells you that, with all its mysterious horror, it is but the shadow of what he bears on his own breast, and that even this, his own red stigma, is no more than the type of what has seared his innermost heart." With a convulsive motion, he tears away the ministerial band from his chest to reveal the red mark on his breast that looks like an A. Then he slumps to the platform, and Chillingworth kneels beside him, saying, "Thou hast escaped me." Dimmesdale then asks God to forgive Chillingworth for his deep sin of revenge. He then asks Pearl to kiss him. She does, then begins to cry, her tears flowing upon her father's chest. With that kiss, Hawthorne tells us, a spell was broken. The great scene of grief in which the wild infant bore a part had developed all her sympathies, and as her tears fell upon her father's cheek, they were the pledge that she would grow up amid human joy and sorrow, nor forever do battle with the world, but be a woman in it. Towards her mother, too, Pearl's errand as a messenger of anguish was all fulfilled. Knowing that Dimmesdale will die, Hester wonders if she will see him again in another life. Arthur is afraid that he may never see Hester again because of his sins, but he is grateful that God has sent Chillingworth to torment him and to encourage him to confess his sin. God knows, and he is merciful," says Dimmesdale. "He hath proved his mercy most of all in my afflictions, by giving me this burning torture to bear upon my breast, by sending yonder dark and terrible old man to keep the torture always at red heat, by bringing me hither to die this death of triumphant ignominy before the people. Had either of these agonies been wanting, I had been lost forever." Arthur Dimmesdale then dies. As the book concludes, Hawthorne attempts to tidy up loose ends. With Dimmesdale dead, Chillingworth finds he has no purpose in life. Within a year he dies, leaving a considerable amount of property in both America and England to Pearl. She is now the richest heiress of her day in the New World, and Hawthorne suggests that her money make her attractive enough to marry into the most devout Puritan family. Soon, Hester and Pearl leave Boston and go to Europe. They are not heard from for several years. Then, Hester returns alone and moves into the same house in which she lived previously. She even wears her red A. Women unhappy in love bring their problems to her, and she soothes them. Pearl is not specifically mentioned, but Hester receives many expensive gifts, and it is assumed that they come from Pearl. Several years later, Hester dies and is buried beside Dimmesdale. A common marker covers both graves. The tombstone reads, "On a field black, the letter A, red." Hawthorne leaves unresolved the question of how the letter or mark came to be on Dimmesdale's chest. He writes that some people believe that it was self-inflicted. Others think Chillingworth caused it through magic and drugs. Still others take the view that the guilt caused the mark, chewing from Dimmesdale's heart outward. There are even those who insist that Dimmesdale had no mark on his breast at all. Overall, the Scarlet Letter is an attack on the rigid aspects of Puritanism. Hawthorne cannot abide intolerance and detests a society that will not forgive slips from the path of virtue. At that time, the Puritans believed in predestination. Some people were destined to be saved and sent to heaven, others would go to hell. Therefore, the Puritans believed that Hester is predestined for hell, or she wouldn't have committed such a sin as adultery. Another theme in the Scarlet Letter is isolationism. Because she has sinned, and therefore destined for hell, Hester is not allowed to be part of the society. She lives alone and away from others. Her child is not allowed to play with other children. And even those Hester befriends make a point of saying negative things about her. When in public, she is taunted by adults and children alike. Only after a lifetime of good works is Hester accepted into the society, and then only on a peripheral basis. Hawthorne also goes to great lengths to express the value of admitting guilt openly. He believes that by Hester wearing her scarlet symbol, that her system is eventually cleansed. Meanwhile, Dimmesdale, by keeping his guilt hidden, creates so much stress it eventually kills him. The sore, or mark on his chest, real or imaginary, is a symbol of his discomfort. Of course, Hester is not truly repentant. She just becomes submissive, which gives the Puritan community the upper hand over her and makes it happy.
This is the end of the session.